One morning, as the sun rose over the Langat River, the tiny village of Banda Tamasha stirred from its slumber. Like any other day, boats docked at the wooden jetty, and fishermen unloaded their catch, while the merchants of the bazaar prepared their stalls for another day of trade. But this would turn out to be no ordinary day. It was November 16th, 1873, and it would forever be remembered as the beginning of the end for Selangor's independence as a country. Visiting Banda Tamasha that morning was a 20-year-old Malay sailor named Mat Syed. Twice a week, he and his crewmates sailed from Malacca, ferrying passengers from the British port and delivering goods to be sold at the bazaar. And on this morning, the crew had an additional task: to collect a large chest from a local Chinese merchant, which was filled with silver coins, and bring it back to Malacca to be deposited in a bank. Mat Syed never liked Banda Tamasha, and neither did his captain. As soon as the chest of silver was safely on board, the crew set off. They rowed all day down a tidal channel known as Jugra, only to be becalmed as they reached the Malacca Strait. With no wind and the tide against them, there was no hope of reaching Malacca. So the crew anchored their boat, cooked some rice, and waited for the tide to turn. As sunset approached, Mat Syed noticed two smaller boats drawing near. When his captain shouted across the water, asking where the other boats were headed, they claimed to be fishermen and said they were hungry. Not suspecting anything was wrong, the captain invited them aboard, saying his crew had just cooked rice and had plenty to share. But these men were not fishermen at all. They were pirates, and they opened fire as soon as they climbed on board. The captain was struck in the head and died instantly. Unarmed and unprepared for an attack, the rest of the crew panicked. Several men tried to escape by jumping overboard, only to be stabbed with spears and dragged back onto the boat, so their corpses could be searched for loot. Mat Syed was lucky. He escaped by clinging to the ship's rudder and submerging himself below the waves for as long as he could. And then, as darkness fell, he picked his moment to slip away into the fading light. He swam to the riverbank, where he found a wooden jetty to hide beneath. Here is Mat Syed's account of what happened next.
I was up to my neck in water, trying my best to remain quiet. I hid there for a quarter of an hour, until I heard the voice of a Bugis man. After a short while, another man came to the jetty, and I listened to them talk. Then the two pirate boats came up to where I was hiding.
Mat Syed was trapped beneath the jetty for more than an hour, listening as the pirates discussed the attack. They were agitated and complained they had failed to kill everybody that expected to find on board. Someone had escaped. Hearing this, Mat Syed realized that this was no spontaneous attack. It had been planned, and as he listened, he learned that the attack had been orchestrated by none other than Sultan Abdul Samad's son, a man named Raja Yaqub. It was Raja Yaqub who had told the pirates how many crew manned the boat, and it was Raja Yaqub the pirates had been told to deliver the silver to. As soon as the coast was clear, Mat Syed made a break for it. He ran all the way back to Banda Tamasha and reported the attack to the first group of men he found.
Sultan Abdul Samad was sleeping, and the men were reluctant to wake him. They asked me if I knew who had committed the murders. But when I said that it was the Sultan's son, Raja Yaqub, they told me to keep my mouth shut. They eventually took me to the Sultan, who questioned me, and I told him everything, except when he asked if I knew who was behind the attack. This time I said that I did not.
It was a lie that probably saved Mat Syed's life. If he had named Raja Yaqub as the mastermind behind the attack, it's unlikely he would have been permitted to leave Banda Tamasha. But as there seemed to be no way of implicating his son, Sultan Abdul Samad saw no risk in allowing Mat Syed to leave. He warned the young sailor to tell no one of the incident and dismissed him with a wave of his hand. Mat Syed gave the Sultan his solemn word to keep the attack secret, and, for a while, he kept that promise. Life in Banda Tamasha returned to its sleepy rhythm, as if nothing had happened at all. My name is Jesse Onslow, and this is Amok in the Jungle, a podcast about the extraordinary lives and struggles of Kuala Lumpur's earliest pioneers. Over the course of 8 episodes, this first season explores the early history of Malaysia's capital city, when Kuala Lumpur was still little more than a tin mining camp. It's a story about power, greed, and the relentless urge to bring order to chaos. In the previous episode, the new British governor, Spicy Andrew, negotiated the Pankor engagement and declared Raja Abdullah as the Sultan of Perak. Meanwhile, Yepaloi returned to Kuala Lumpur and defeated Raja Mahdi's army, sending the rebels fleeing into the jungle. In this episode, Spicy Andrew pays a visit to Selangor. This is episode 5, A Careless Heathen Philosopher. Early in the morning of February 6th, 1874, the Sultan of Selangor was rudely awoken. With tentative diffidence, his manservant prodded him awake, claiming it was an emergency. The British had blockaded all of Selangor's waterways and were now coming up the Langat River to Banda Tamasha. As he pulled his arthritic bones from his bed, the Sultan recalled the last time the British had paid him a visit. On that occasion, they'd announced their arrival with cannons fired towards his home. This time, their greeting was more polite, yet somehow much more ominous. It took the form of a letter requesting the Sultan's presence on one of their steamships. Sultan Abdul Samad realized at once that Mat Syed had broken his promise. The young sailor had sworn he'd tell no one of the pirates or the attack, but he must have informed the British police after returning to Malacca. Now, the British had come to the Sultan's home, and if they discovered that his own son was behind the attack, who knew what they would do? The Sultan owned little in the way of ceremonial robes or formal attire. Despite being the ruler of Selangor, he liked to think of himself as retired, and made a conscious effort to avoid being involved in diplomatic affairs. With purposeful slowness, he dressed in his sarong, a simple cotton kilt, and his songket dastar, a yellow bandana he wore on his head at all times. To complete his outfit, he slipped his royal kris into a belt around his waist. Still topless, Sultan Abdul Samad emerged from his palace a few moments later. The bright white steamship was anchored in front of the fortified walls that enclosed his palace. On its deck, he could see British officers casually sipping tea and spreading jam on their scones. The Sultan didn't know his name yet, but he watched as Spicy Andrew casually peered up the muzzles of the Malay cannons pointed at his steamship, inspecting them as nonchalantly as if they were no more dangerous than a toothbrush. The Sultan couldn't see James Wheeler Woodford Birch, the Englishman who'd interrogated him last time, but he did see his own son-in-law, Tunku Kuden. He also noted a large contingent of soldiers wearing blue jackets lurking below deck. He always knew his children would land him in trouble, but the old ruler never suspected it would end like this. Sultan Abdul Samad summoned his most trusted Pawang. He instructed the sorcerer to make a display of consulting the spirits, and then to tell the British it was, sadly, an ill-fated day to conduct state business. The Sultan doubted this would deter them, but he needed time to think. Once back inside his home, and out of sight of his unwelcome visitors, the Sultan called for his son, Raja Yaqub, and for his opium pipe. As the bitter, earthy smoke filled his lungs, all urgency left the Sultan. His son joined him, and, in between fevers of tranquil oblivion, they discussed their predicament. The Sultan didn't understand why Raja Yaqub had resorted to piracy. If his son wanted money, he would have happily provided it. He implored his son to run into the jungle and hide, but the young Raja refused. He wasn't afraid of Europeans and insisted on joining his father in boarding the British steamship. After a particularly potent hit of his pipe, the Sultan emerged from his numb daze to the sound of a foreign voice. A British officer was at the door, smoking a cigar and chatting with the Sultan's bodyguards. It was too late. Here is Spicy Andrew's account of how the old ruler was teased from his palace.
After a couple of hours waiting, I sent Bradell, my Attorney General, to see what the hold-up was. He landed alone, smoking a cigar as if for a stroll. He speaks Malay better than a Malay, so he was able to lounge through the bazaar, past the sentries, and step quietly into the palace without incident. The Sultan was at last convinced to come, provided the steamer was kept attached to the shore by ropes, and that he might come on board over a temporary jetty, which we improvised on the spot. When he arrived, he was joined by several hundred of his fellows. He is a jolly, good-natured opium eater, and was eager to explain that he looked at piracy as a young man's affair. He claimed not to bother with it himself.
Aside from some pleasantries and idle chit-chat, nothing of substance was discussed in this meeting. Spicy Andrew suggested they arrange to talk again, in private. But the Malays hated the idea. Less than 3 weeks had passed since the Pankor Treaty was signed in Perak, and already everyone in Banda Tamasha had heard of the heavy-handed negotiations and was suspicious of the British. Despite this, Sultan Abdul Samad overruled his concerned chiefs and invited the British governor into his palace.
I was taken into a small room where the Sultan was flanked by his sons and some 8 or 10 chiefs. Here I opened on the subject of my mission. I told the Sultan how much better it would be for him if he supported his son-in-law Tunku Kuden against the pirates. I then said I wanted to settle matters peacefully, otherwise I would be forced to sweep him and all the pirates off the face of the earth.
The British officials at the meeting gave mixed accounts of the Sultan afterwards. Bradell, the Attorney General, called the ruler of Selangor a rather careless heathen philosopher, and suggested he was out of his mind on opium, while another British officer gave a more nuanced perspective.
The Sultan has hitherto borne the reputation of being a confirmed opium eater, but he did not strike me as being in any way lethargic. On the contrary, he seems very sharp and intelligent. The only sign of a weakness in character was his indecisive manner of walking up and down when required to make up his mind. He constantly fidgeted with his headdress, taking it off and putting it on again as he listened and considered proposals.
The discussions started off well, but quickly turned sour. The British had already rounded up the pirates and imprisoned them in Malacca. But as the crime had happened in Selangor, they had no jurisdiction to legally put them on trial. Spicy Andrew insisted that Sultan Abdul Samad should take responsibility and sentence the pirates to death for their crime. He also accused Raja Yaqub of being the mastermind behind the attack, an accusation which prompted the Sultan's son to launch into an explosive rant. He blamed Tunku Kuden for everything, saying if the Viceroy hadn't been so busy making war in Selangor, war for the profit of foreigners, then maybe people wouldn't be forced into committing such desperate crimes. The meeting descended into chaos. Spicy Andrew asked the Sultan point blank whether Tunku Kuden still had his confidence as the Viceroy of Selangor.
To this, the Sultan said that Tunku Kuden had not brought his wife, the Sultan's daughter, to see him for 2 years, but apart from that, he could make no complaint against the Viceroy.
Tunku Kuden had declined to attend the meeting. He knew many in Banda Tamasha were still loyal to his enemy, Raja Mahdi, and he had read the letter written by his father-in-law, which accused him of being a traitor. Because of this, when he heard that Spicy Andrew had requested his presence at the meeting, his first inclination was to fetch for his revolver. But Tunku Kuden was, eventually, convinced that arriving at the Sultan's palace with a loaded gun might set the wrong tone, and begrudgingly joined the meeting unarmed.
When Tunku Kuden reached the audience hall, the Sultan beckoned him and took him behind the curtains where the ladies were, and in a little time they both returned looking quite pleased.
It's unknown what the two men discussed. Some historians speculate that Sultan Abdul Samad was terrified that Tunku Kuden wanted to depose him, or that the Sultan asked for reassurances that he wouldn't be killed by the British. Though it's equally possible they simply arranged for the Sultan's daughter to take a trip to Banda Tamasha, to be reunited with her father. We'll never know exactly what was said. What we do know is, after speaking with Tunku Kuden, Sultan Abdul Samad conceded to all of Spicy Andrew's demands. He swore to keep the peace in the Malacca Strait. He agreed to burn and destroy all of his fortifications. And finally, he issued an order for the pirates to be put on trial in Selangor. He even agreed to Tunku Kudin acting as judge. The negotiations over, Spicy Andrew departed Banda Tamasha in a good mood. He believed the government of Selangor was finally willing to maintain peace and order. There was no doubt in his mind that the men were guilty, and he was confident they'd be executed by their sultan. But, just to be sure, Spicy Andrew left a few gunboats behind on the Langat River until the sentence was carried out. A reminder to that careless heathen philosopher of the promises he had made. Back in the jungle, Yapaloi was still unaware of Spicy Andrew's visit to Banda Tamasha, or even that there had been a pirate attack at all. He was too busy beginning the slow work of rebuilding Kuala Lumpur. As he assessed the damage caused by the war, he found hardly anything remained to show where people had once lived. Just 12 buildings had survived the fighting. Everything else had been burned and then washed away in the monsoon floods. Yapaloi's own home was in ruins, and behind it, in what was once his garden, he found nothing remained of the shrine he had built for his mentor, Capitan Shin. Looking upon this desolate jungle clearing, Yapaloi suspected his troubles were far from over, and these suspicions were confirmed when he ventured out into the jungle to inspect the tin mines. As he and his men came to Ampang, the oldest and largest of the mines, their hearts were broken. It had always been a noisy place. They remembered the splash and the creak of the water wheel as it turned, the clatter of the mechanical pump that drove it, the shouts of the overseers and the tallymen, the songs and jokes they had shared. Now, the mines were silent. The water wheels, the pumps, the runnels, the troughs for washing ore, the smelting houses, the storehouses, the dormitories where the miners had once lived, they'd all been destroyed. Only a few charred timbers remained, showing here and there where buildings once stood. The only sound that broke the silence was the men's voices as they echoed against the flooded pits. They spoke in muted tones, mumbling that the land was cursed, that the mines were haunted by the ghosts of their fallen comrades, that the Hantus had forsaken them. They would have to start from scratch, and why should they stay and do it here? Back in Kuala Lumpur, Yapaloi's elite fighters had returned from Kanching, boasting of a great victory. 300 Gi Hin men had surrendered after facing just a short demonstration of the bamboo rockets, leaving Kanching empty as it burned. The captives were bound and marched down the jungle trail to Kuala Lumpur, where they were paraded through Medan Pasar. The gathered crowds singled out captives who they'd seen kill friends or relatives. Soon, a mob formed to demand retribution, and it wasn't long before they got their wish. The captives were led to the banks of the Klang River and pushed to their knees. One by one, their necks were slit, and their heads were severed from their bodies. Then, the lifeless corpses were kicked into the muddy water, staining it red with blood. It was at this point that Yapaloi returned from inspecting the ruined mines. Of the 300 Heathen men, only 70 were still alive when the Capitan China realized what was happening, and he was horrified. In what was the Klang War's only recorded instance of clemency, Yapaloi ordered the prisoners to be untied, declaring that the war was over and he wanted no more bloodshed in Kuala Lumpur. He allowed the captured Heathen men to settle in Kuala Lumpur on the condition they pledged their loyalty to him. These men became the labourers who rebuilt Yapaloi's temple. But where once it had been solely dedicated to Capitan Shin, now a second deity was to be honoured. Ah Sir, Yapaloi's old friend, who had been murdered in Kanching all those years ago, was celebrated as a god and given equal prominence in the new temple. Yapaloi realized that he would need more than fear and respect if he wanted to rebuild Kuala Lumpur. Only a hopeful vision for the future could convince the miners to stay. What they needed now, after so much war and violence, was a symbol of peace and prosperity. And, in Yapaloi's mind, nobody represented that more than his old friend, Sweet Potato, Ah Sir. This is how the Sinsa Siya Temple was born. Justice was not an alien concept in Selangor. Under Bugis rule, disputes were typically settled by the local Raja, and if the case was serious enough to warrant execution, it would be brought before the Sultan. There was no formal ceremony for trials or codified legal procedure. Instead, the Raja or the Sultan would make their judgment after interviewing the defendant and witnesses in private, while the sentence would be determined after discussion with the local imam or sometimes a pawang. But when the day came to charge the Langat pirates who attacked Mat Syed's boat at the beginning of this episode, it was a trial unlike any Selangor had ever seen. When Tunku Kudan arrived to preside as judge, he made clear his intention to hold a British-style trial. He even brought his British friend, J.G. Davidson, claiming the Scottish lawyer was there to act as an impartial observer who could ensure due process and bring integrity to the trial. Except when the trial got underway, it was immediately apparent that Davidson was really there to act as the prosecutor. The defendants were given no legal defense or representation. They were not even examined by Davidson. And there was only one witness, Mat Syed. His story was straightforward. He had been working on the boat, he jumped into the water as the pirates boarded, and then he hid under a jetty until he could escape. When asked to identify the pirates, Mat Syed didn't hesitate to point at the defendants. And then he claimed they were all working for the Sultan's son, Raja Yaqub. Here is a description of Raja Yaqub, which was written by a Malay scholar named Munshi Muhammad Ibrahim.
Raja Yaqub is the middle son of Sultan Abdul Samad. He is stout, heavily built, and tall in stature, and his face is dumpy, pallid, and yellowish. When I saw him, his clothing was soiled and caked with filth, and his speech was not articulate, but rambling and disjointed. His lips were black, and his teeth too were filthy and stained with tobacco. I guess he was about 30 years old, though he looked very feeble as a result of smoking opium. I thought to myself that he must have been extremely lax in practicing the Muslim religion, if he practiced it at all, for it was rather the things forbidden him by Allah that he practiced.
It was a short trial. No further evidence was taken before Davidson and Tunku Kuden retired to deliberate the verdict. They had no doubt that the men were guilty, but what to do about Raja Yaqub? If they accepted the evidence that the Sultan's son was involved, then he would need to be sentenced too. And Tunku Kuden knew his father-in-law would never forgive him for that. So, after a short recess, Tunku Kuden ruled that the evidence against Raja Yaqub was non-pertinent and struck it from the record, before declaring the defendants guilty and sentencing them to death. The execution took place on a mud bank overlooking the river where the crime had taken place. In the background, Royal Navy gunboats now lay anchored. Tunku Kuden and Davidson sat in chairs under the shade of a row of coconut trees and watched as the condemned men kneeled in the sun and awaited the arrival of Sultan Abdul Samad. But there was no sign of him. Impatient, Tunku Kuden sent a letter reminding his absent-minded father-in-law of the date, only to be dismayed when messengers returned a few hours later. The Sultan was not with them, and they carried no written response from the ruler. Instead, they handed the Sultan's ceremonial kris to Tunku Kuden and instructed him that the Sultan wished the dagger to be used for the executions. The message was clear. If Tunku Kuden wanted the men killed, he would have to do it himself. Tunku Kuden did not rise to this challenge. Instead, he passed the kris to one of his henchmen and returned to his seat in the shade. Only after the condemned men fell lifeless to the ground and their families had rushed to collect their bodies for burial, Tunku Kuden rose from his seat. He strolled into the sun and planted a sign in the earth, which simply said, "The place of execution." Before departing Banda Tamasha, Davidson and Tunku Kuden had one last piece of business. Davidson took Raja Yaqub aside and warned him that he wouldn't be spared again if there were any more reports of piracy. And then, to add insult to injury, he billed the Sultan of Selangor $5,000 in legal expenses. Their work done, Tunku Kuden and Davidson boarded their steamship and were escorted home by the Royal Navy gunboats. After receiving confirmation of the executions, Spicy Andrew decided it was time for another report back to London.
I fear the Colonial Office will not easily be made to think that I have done well. But I know I have, and time will show it. The Malays, like every other rude Eastern nation, require to be treated like children and need to be taught good government.
The report went on to detail Spicy Andrew's plan for the region. He believed Selangor, like Perak, needed a British resident, and he wouldn't rest until he found a way to install one. All he needed was an excuse, any excuse, and he would find a way to pressure the Sultan of Selangor into signing away his independence. The report was proofread and sent off by Spicy Andrew's second-in-command, James Wheeler Woodford Birch, who, after reading it, realised that British rule was inevitable across the region. The most likely candidate to become British resident in Selangor was J.G. Davidson, as he already had a close relationship with Tunku Kuden and knew the country well. The question was, who would Spicy Andrew appoint to Perak? Birch decided to write a letter putting himself forward as a candidate.
I believe I can really be of use. My whole life has been spent in opening up and enriching a new country, and in teaching the native chiefs good government. It's my experience as an executive and judicial officer for the last 27 years that Eastern people are perfectly incapable of good government, or even of maintaining order, without the guidance or assistance from some stronger hand.
Birch desperately wanted to become Perak's resident, but the odds were stacked against him. From the moment he'd arrived in Singapore, Spicy Andrew had taken a strong dislike to him and avoided him at all costs, even though Birch was technically his second-in-command. Spicy Andrew found him highly strung, pedantic, and overly eager to please. He also accused him of being petty and annoying, and ignored Birch's letter. So Birch drew up a plan to solve one of Spicy Andrew's biggest problems. With the Pankor engagement, Spicy Andrew had declared Raja Abdullah as Sultan of Perak, though the Malays still refused to recognize him. According to Malay custom, Raja Abdullah could not be Sultan until he completed his inauguration ceremony, and that hadn't happened because it required the Perak royal regalia, the crown jewels of the state, and they were in the possession of his rival, Raja Ismail. Until Raja Abdullah got hold of the royal regalia, he would never be accepted as Sultan. So Birch made it his mission to go and retrieve them, hoping his success would prove that he was the right man to become Perak's British resident. Private letters reveal that Spicy Andrew never really cared if the mission was successful or not. He ended up approving the plan, not because he saw the royal regalia as particularly important, but simply because he figured it would get Birch out of his hair for a few weeks. Though Spicy Andrew did see a problem. Birch barely spoke any Malay, which would have made the mission impossible. So he ordered the young cadet, Frank Swetnam, to go along as his translator. Birch and Swetnam arrived in Perak in April 1874. As they made their way up the Perak River, the two men were awed by their surroundings.
We revelled in one of the loveliest views I have ever seen. The stream is crystal clear with deep pools, and on both banks lie villages of palm-roofed cottages hidden in groves of fruit trees facing the river with rice fields behind them. The river is the main highway of Perak and is never without boats passing up and down, fishermen casting nets, and the riverine folk bathing in or carrying water from the stream, while behind the river in almost every direction are ranges of hills of ever-increasing height. It is a Malay paradise, and we were deeply impressed.
When they were around halfway up the Perak River, they were stopped unexpectedly. The local Malay chiefs earned their keep by charging a toll on the boats going up and down the river. Understanding this, Birch and Swetnam were expecting to have their cargo checked, but when they stepped ashore, they were told they'd entered the territory of Raja Yusuf, the true Sultan of Perak, somebody neither of them had ever heard of. Swetnam's journal, however, records the impression the Raja made on them.
We went on shore and visited Raja Yusuf, a man whose existence has been ignored in the most curious way. In his village we found a set of very fine men who told us the Raja would be most happy to see us, but he apologized for the humbleness of his house. When we met, I was surprised to see a big, strong, good-looking man of 45, who in appearance and manner is by far the most royal-looking man I have ever seen in Perak.
Raja Yusuf was the Perak chief who'd rejected both Raja Abdullah and Raja Ismail as Sultan, despite being deeply unpopular among the other chiefs. He insisted he was the rightful ruler of Perak, as he explained to Birch and Swetnam.
The British governor has crowned Abdullah as Sultan, but it is not right. I am the man who by birth and by the customs of Perak ought to rule this land. If the governor will do what is right and elect me as Sultan, all will go well. But if not, I will fight for my rights. The best way forward would be for the English government to take over the whole of Perak and pay the chiefs a monthly sum to administer it on their behalf.
As Raja Yusuf talked, Swetnam became convinced Spicy Andrew had installed the wrong Sultan. Raja Yusuf gave them documents which clearly showed that he was the true heir to the throne. He went on to explain that he could have respected Raja Abdullah's appointment as Sultan if it had come directly from the British governor, but he had heard the decision was voted for by the Malay chiefs present on Pankor Island. Because of this, Raja Yusuf saw Raja Abdullah's appointment as illegitimate and was determined to fight it. The only reason he hadn't already gone to war was because he'd heard the British were going to sort everything out. Now, they acted like they'd never even heard of him.
As we departed, Raja Yusuf gifted us a goat, and Mr. Birch gave him in return a copy of the Pankor Treaty and 2 chairs. The latter, I am sure, will be very useful, as they had only 1 stool in the whole village, and that was in very feeble health.
Birch and Swetnam arrived at Raja Ismail's village a few days later. To their surprise, Raja Ismail, the former acting sultan, initially agreed to give up the regalia, but said it was against Malay custom to allow foreigners to handle it. He would only give it directly to his rival, Raja Abdullah. When Birch suggested they could get a Malay to carry it, Raja Ismail complained he didn't have the royal regalia with him. The crown jewels of Perak were kept at a further town known as Kinta, and he would send for them only if Raja Abdullah came to collect them. It gradually became clear that Raja Ismail was making up excuses to buy time. To him, the situation was simple. Raja Abdullah was a coward who would never dare to come upriver to get the regalia. Before long, he grew tired of Birch and Swetnam and dismissed them from his palace. He also prohibited everybody in his village from talking to them or selling them food, which was a big problem for Birch and Swetnam because they had expected to be treated as guests and hadn't bothered to pack enough supplies to feed themselves. By now, the mission was clearly a failure, but Birch refused to leave until they got the royal regalia. Like a petulant child, he just couldn't accept that he wasn't going to get what he wanted. The 2 British men stormed back to their boat to rummage through their supplies and found their only remaining provisions were 3 bottles of claret wine. It was as they opened the first of these that Birch began to hatch a new plan. They could say they were going to Kinter to buy food, but really go there to get the royal regalia. By the end of the bottle, Birch was convinced that his plan was foolproof. But when Raja Ismail heard the British diplomats were headed to Kinter, he didn't miss a beat. He immediately offered to provide elephants for their journey, assuring them it wouldn't take long to prepare them. Believing their deception was working, Birch and Swetnam opened their second bottle of wine and drank it as they waited. And waited. It was when they reached the bottom of their second bottle of wine that Birch and Swetnam became restless. Each time they asked how long it would take for the elephants to arrive, they got a different answer. They are sleeping. They are over in the next village, but they're on their way. It turns out those elephants were sick, so we're fetching more from a different village. It became a ridiculous sort of game. The Malays took turns coming up with ever more elaborate reasons for the delay, and delighted in Birch's growing exasperation. The third bottle of wine was opened and finished before Birch and Swetnam finally conceded defeat. Realizing the situation was hopeless, they stumbled back into their boat and cast off downstream. Upon returning to Singapore, Birch told Spicy Andrew that the mission had failed, but Frank Swetnam disagreed. The young cadet pointed out that they'd managed to find the true heir to Perak's throne, and he even seemed to support British interference. Swetnam suggested they give up on the royal regalia and even Raja Abdullah, and instead switch their support to Raja Yusuf. Spicy Andrew, however, couldn't have cared less about the outcome of the mission. In his mind, the Pankor engagement had already solved all of Perak's problems, regardless of what the local Malay chiefs complained about. Spicy Andrew's attention had already turned to his next objective, bringing Selangor under British control, as he reported back to London.
It is my conviction that we can no longer delay the intervention which the causes of civilization and good order now so loudly demand of us.
My name is Jesse Onslow, and you've been listening to Amok in the Jungle. The voice actors in this episode were Ahmad Fadzil, Lachlan Lucas, Noah Norton, JJ Yu, Luke Skypixel, Muamin Rashid, Tim Redman, and Paul Cooper. This episode was recorded by Kit Lee at Vine Music Studio, with music and post-production by Wendy Graham. You can follow me on Twitter at Jesse Onslow, or join the Reddit community over at Amok Podcast. This podcast is made available for free and without ads, which means I can only keep making it with your support. If you're able to make a donation, please consider subscribing to my paid newsletter at amokpodcast.com. By subscribing, you'll get access to maps, archive photos, and other extra content. I'll also post a list of the books and journals used to research each episode at amokpodcast.com. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please leave a nice review wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to subscribe for future updates. In the next episode, Frank Swetnam is sent to Banda Tamasha, while in Kuala Lumpur, Yapaloy encounters a threat unlike anything he's faced before. Until then, terima kasih banyak dan jumpa lagi.